Hello, my name is Whitney Trettien, and I'm here to introduce you to this book, Theophila. This is the copy that's held at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania, and its call number is Folio EC65 B4387 652T. Now, this copy has been rebound by Charles Merton in the early 19th century, but originally it probably would have been bound in the 17th century in a leather cover with this coat of arms. This is the coat of arms of the author Edward Benlowes, who hand-assembled and possibly even bound this book himself at his home at Brent Hall in Finchingfield, where he had something of a domestic print workshop. This copy has a kind of interesting provenance that's marked on these pages. I'll just point out that it was once owned by Jerome Kern, a famous composer responsible for Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Old Man River, and some other 20th century classics. Kern also collected rare books, and this is exactly the sort of book that a 20th century collector of his sort would have been interested in. Why is that? Well, it is lavishly illustrated with engravings, forming almost a multimedia assemblage. It's a poem, Theophila or Love's Sacrifice. The kernel of it is an 8-canto poem that documents the journey of Theophila, which is a feminine figure for the soul as she journeys to heaven. It was written by Edward Benlowes, who we see here in this elaborate authorial portrait that he himself commissioned and was cut by Francis Barlow. Sometimes in some copies he's written a Latin motto or his name there. It was printed by Roger Norton in 1652 in London and sold by Henry Seal and Humphrey Moseley at their bookshops in London. But as I mentioned before, it was assembled by Benlowes at his home, where he inserted found engravings and other bits and pieces. Now, interestingly enough, the book was also set to heirs. Portions of the book was set to heirs by John Jenkins. John Jenkins was a popular domestic composer, hence the connection to Jerome Kern being particularly interesting. Now, we don't have any actual extant music, as far as I know of or has been discovered by John Jenkins, that actually includes lines from Theophila. So the music may be lost, or perhaps it was just this kind of title page was just a sales technique of sorts. Other books that were sold by Humphrey Moseley advertised themselves as being set to heirs by different domestic composers. But nonetheless, what we have here on this title page and authorial portrait is an image of the book as a multimedia object. As I mentioned, the book Theophila follows the journey of the soul, figured as the woman Theophila, as she ascends to heaven. And this first engraving, it's actually an etching by Francis Barlow that was commissioned by Edward Benlowes to accompany the first canto here, I think depicts very well what the book is about. So we have here Theophila. She's dressed in the garb of a king, which of course signals in the Neoplatonic tradition that she, as a feminine figure for the soul would have been sovereign over the body. It figures her sovereignty over the body. But of course, we're in 1652. King Charles had been beheaded in 1649. We're in the interregnum, and it's hard to imagine that readers looking at this etching at the time wouldn't have seen a figure for King Charles the Martyr or a figure for the recently beheaded king. Edward Benlowes was a royalist, as was the bookseller Humphrey Moseley, as were many of his friends, in fact, and so there's a royalist theme being evinced here. We also have the author Edward Benlowes, seen here as a curly-haired youth. He's in the process of writing Theophila. We see him with this kind of pen and these papers, and I love how animated the papers are. They almost kind of look alive beneath his fingers. He's writing the poem, but it also looks as if he's sketching Theophila. He's looking at her as if he's sketching, which again signals the multimedia nature of the process of his composition. Benlowes is interested in both the visual and the verbal. He treats himself as both a kind of poet, but also as a composer. He uses the word for composer for himself, as does one of the authors of his commendatory verse, which is a nice link to his process of composition as almost being like a process of musical composition, or even composer as a term for printing, the composition of type. So we have figured the process of writing down here. Up above we have figured the product, the book Theophila. Now we have an eagle carrying the book, and an eagle next to this kind of curly-haired youth would have recalled for many readers of Theophila probably St. John the Evangelist or John the Evangelist. His symbol was an eagle. He was depicted as a curly-haired youth, and he was a mystical evangelist, and Benlowes is writing in a mystical register, so it makes sense that he would connect his own poetry to John's gospel. But an eagle actually also would have recalled for many readers the myth of Ganymede. This is the myth of a beautiful Greek boy, a shepherd boy, whom Zeus, the god, falls in love with, and Zeus disguises himself as an eagle and descends and snatches away Ganymede and carries him up to Mount Olympus. And it was a very well-known myth for homoerotic desire and homoerotic love and attraction in early modern England. There were many images of eagles snatching away beautiful boys in emblem books, for instance, and certainly Benlowes was familiar with this myth. Of course, we don't have a beautiful boy here. We have the book Theophila, and I think the replacement of the boy with the book here signals the way in which the ornamentation of Benlowes' Theophila is serving to beautify the book and turn it, in fact, into a desirable object. Now, as I mentioned, the poem is an 8-canto poem, and you can see just paging through the leaves here that it has very interesting typography. We have here pattern poems. This is the end of the first canto, preparing the Theophila's sacrifice. So we have a literal altar for her sacrifice here. But we also have the kind of exuberant use of small caps and italics and large caps and all different kinds of typographic adornments that get even more exuberant as the poem goes on. So here we have a page towards the end of the 8-canto section of Theophila, and here we have just large caps being used to describe God, right? Emanation, God, trinal unity, omnipresence, really kind of using the typography to express the prayer and devoutness of the poet here. Now, if Theophila the book were just a poem that had engravings commissioned for it, it would be interesting enough. But in fact, it also has packed into it many found engravings, which you can see in the edition online that I've made to accompany this video. So for instance, here is a repurposed engraving that actually is by Francis Klein, and it originally shows astronomy. Astronomia would have been engraved up here. Astronomy pointing out the stars. It's been repurposed as a figure for Theophila, and again, probably Benlowes, the author here. We have the eagle, we have an older curly-haired man, and we have a young woman. So again, this kind of engraving, although it was originally made for something else, it's being repurposed by Benlowes here. We also have the use of intaglio prints on some pages. Here we have a plate that's been printed onto the end of this page. Some copies don't have this plate in it. We also have a very large number of preliminaries, and many people wrote commendatory verse for this particular book. In the accompanying edition, you can see some more information about these authors. They range from royalists to parliamentarians. They range from Catholics to non-Catholics. There's a wide range of people represented here, all friends or acquaintances of Benlowes. You also have a large number of preliminary poems written by Benlowes himself, which is somewhat unusual. I'll point out a few interesting features of these poems. So for instance, here's a poem, To My Fancy Upon Theophila, and you have repurposed here a set of erotic alphabetic woodcuts by Peter Flotner. These were originally cut in the 1530s, so over 100 years, in fact, before Theophila was printed. But they're being used as large initials here for this poem, which is trying to lay out Benlowes is trying to lay out his method of composition. It's a really kind of interesting poem. For instance, he describes his method of composition as being with artful method miscellin so. Miscellin is mixed seed, but also refers to kind of a miscellany. So the book is an assemblage of different prints and engravings. It's an assemblage of different poems packed together, that kind of artfully packed together, that through their very miscellany produce some kind of devotional meaning for Benlowes. You also have amongst these preliminaries this engraving. This is by Wenceslaus Haller. It's from a very well-known series of the Four Seasons that depicts women dressed in the different garbs of the four seasons, winter, spring, fall, and summer. This is the winter woman, and she's covered all in furs. And in fact, the plate originally had a caption here. Benlowes seems to have scratched it off, and he probably printed plates like this and also the Astronomia at his home in Brent Hall. He had a rolling press, as I mentioned, and domestic kind of tools for domestic printmaking. And I suspect that because, and I suspect he had the plate and printed himself because the engraving has actually been kind of scratched off. Other extant copies of this, if he had just been kind of buying up plates and inserting them, would have retained the engraving. So he's bought the plate and then repurposed this popular image as an illustration for this poem. This poem is an address to women readers. It begins, "Ladies, we jangle not in schools, but strain to set church music, at which saints, being met, may warble from heaven's praise," or warble forth heaven's praise, rather. So the poem goes on to describe how women readers should read Theophila and see in Theophila and her sacrifice to get to heaven a model for how they should act. And he uses all this kind of springy language. To this spring garden, virgins chaste and fair, couched in pure thoughts, make your repair, right? So be like Theophila, and you will bloom with flowers of modesty and grace. So for a poem that's all about kind of blooming with these flowers of modesty and grace for women, it's quite interesting to have this Haller engraving of a woman covered in furs, a winter woman covered in furs, accompanying it. What we have here then is Benlowes repurposing a found image to produce this kind of metaphysical juxtaposition. On the one hand, springy flowers in the text, in the poem. On the other hand, modesty, the modesty of woman being figured as actually covering herself as if she's in the cold of winter. And we also have here just a print that's actually about women's garb, about women's dress, being repurposed as a metaphor for modesty. This is very emblematic of how Benlowes uses the engravings that he finds and repurposes throughout Theophila. Finally, I'll point out that towards the very end, we have these pattern poems. This one is printed in 1632. I don't know the date of this one, but these are definitely either found prints or plates that show up towards the very end of Theophila in most copies. Again, this is indicative of his method. He finds something that interests him, he inserts it. Because Benlowes is assembling every copy himself at his home and having it bound in his arms, every single copy of this book is different. Some copies have engravings that other copies don't. Some copies have engravings inserted in places where they don't appear commonly in other copies. So the text is almost the same, or rather the text is the same, but the book is almost the same in every instance, but it's nonetheless different. And that variance is part of what originally drew me to Theophila as a project. In the accompanying digital edition that you see here, you can explore more about Theophila and take a tour of the various different features of this book. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy spending some time and learn more about my friend Edward Benlowes and his unusual 1652 book, Theophila.